I hope everybody had a chance to peruse Marianna's book, which we're going to talk a little bit about. So I am thrilled to have Marianna Gatto with us here, founder of the Italian American Museum in Los Angeles. And we have so much to cover. Don't know how we're going to do it in just 45 minutes, but I think, first of all, you should tell us a little bit about you. Lots of people have met you over the years here and there, but where did you grow up? Why did you have a sense of being Italian American?
Well, I am one of the few, I think at least in other folks' eyes, native Angelinas who is of Italian extraction. I was born in Los Angeles, still live there the majority of the time. And from a very early age, I had this connection to my heritage and really wanted to explore it more. Didn't always have the resources or, it was kind of a puzzle to figure out how I fit into Los Angeles. I have always been interested in Italian American issues and history, and that led me to where I am today.
Well, that's great. So you gave a talk for us a few years ago on Zoom, back when we had to do things on Zoom, kind of about the evolution of Italian Americans in California, and you talked a lot about two facets in particular. One was Italians and their relationship to the agricultural industry in Northern and Southern California, and also, very interestingly, the Italian-American connection to things like canned tuna fish and the sort of industrialization of food products. And it was I think it was a fascinating talk, period, but I think it was a revelation to a lot of people how deeply embedded Italians were in those industries. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about, because that's very different than the New York experience, where people came and were largely in the construction industry. And, most of us in this room are descended from people who came here more or less 1900 and had a very similar pathway to assimilation. So tell us about the California version.
Sure. Italians began settling in Los Angeles 200 years ago. And in the 1820s, before there was a California, before there was an Italy.
That's true, actually.
And they have influenced really every facet of the city's development. Many of the early Italians, those who arrived in the 1820s, 1850s, were drawn by the possibility to engage in agriculture, viticulture, fishing, that sort of thing. And they, unlike the Italians, as you said, who came to New York, who were largely like industrial, many of the Italians who came to Los Angeles were able to kind of continue on with what they had been doing in Italy, largely, again, agriculture, viticulture. Los Angeles is, in many ways, it's a climate very similar to Italy. And so these early Italians became ranchers. Many people aren't aware that the wine industry, California's wine industry, actually began in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is the winemaking capital of the state long before Napa. Before Prohibition, there were about 100 wineries in greater Los Angeles. And these early Italian pioneers really kind of helped make California the agricultural giant that it is. They figured prominently in the wine industry. One of the wealthiest men in the world, that's who he was referred to, Secondo Guasti, established a 5,000-acre vineyard just outside of Los Angeles proper. And so many of the early Italians to settle in the region were part of like chain migration movements, Italians who were attracted to fishing, agriculture, those types of things.
Well, so one of the things I've learned since I came here 5.5 years ago was that the canning industry actually largely started in Naples with canning tomatoes. And I'm wondering if, like in the canned fishing industries in California, was that a technology that transferred, or did it organically grow up in LA too as just a new technology, or did the Italians have any connection to establishing that?
So there were a number of prominent Italian fishing families that were involved in canneries. Many Italian-American women, interestingly enough, worked in the canneries. That was one of the largest employers of Italian-American women. The women were often nicknamed tuna nurses because their uniforms were white and resembled those of nurses. And so you would see these women, boarding buses every day to work in places like San Pedro, in these canneries. But many of the early canneries were, a lot of them were Anglo-owned or Slavs, but there were a couple Italians who also were co-owners of these canneries, like Starkist, for instance. It's now largely based off, and elsewhere, but Starkist was a Southern California, Los Angeles company.
Oh, fascinating. So, as we fast forward through Italian-American history in Los Angeles, one of the most interesting books I ever read in my planning life, having nothing to do with Italian-American history, is a book that Mike Davis wrote called City of Quartz. And it's really about, in the mid-century, as California really grows and the suburbs are growing, and there begins to be a fair amount of discrimination against different ethnic groups in the greater Los Angeles area, and you kind of have this growing proliferation of ungated, gated communities. And I wonder, where were Italian Americans in this? Had they assimilated and so they were unaffected, or were they part of the groups too that were a little suspect and were kept out?
Okay, so let's go back. So, because there's three kind of interesting answers to your question. So, the earliest Italians arrived in Los Angeles in 1820s, when Los Angeles was still part of Mexico. Just like quick history lesson, Los Angeles is founded in 1781 as a colonial outpost of Spain, as a civilian settlement of Spain, and Mexico earns its independence from Spain in 1821. Italians start arriving in Los Angeles in 1827. So just about 50 years after LA is established. And, we all say Los Angeles now, but the complete name of the city is El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles, the pueblo, or the town of Our Lady, Queen of Angels. So LA, in its, from its beginnings, was a Catholic city. And a Latin city. And Italians experienced less prejudice in Los Angeles as being Latin, similar Latin culture, sharing the Catholic religion, a similar language. So some of the early Italians achieve upward mobility at a far earlier rate than they do elsewhere in the nation. And, in their very early days, there aren't Italian women in Los Angeles, so Italian men often marry who were known as the California women, the women who lived in California before it became part of the United States, which that was 1850. And so, we see Italians like the Lanfranco brothers, they intermarried with the Sepulveda family. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, Sepulveda is one of the largest streets in the world. The Sepulveda family owned over 100,000 acres of land. And so this early group of Italians become very, prominent, and they faced less prejudice than elsewhere. Not every Italian who came to Los Angeles settled in an Italian enclave, though we did have 6 of them at one time. There were 6 Italian neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And so some of the early neighborhoods weren't always the most desirable places to live. Some of them were considered slums, and maybe we can come back to that in a second, because you see figures that are known in New York, like Jacob Riis, who comes out to Los Angeles and visits one of these Italian neighborhoods. That's like the notorious slum. But so, these early neighborhoods tend to be like right around the city's core, and most of us, what's our desire in the world? To have like the white picket fence and the American dream. So Italians began leaving some of these neighborhoods at an earlier time than they did in other places like New York, because there's more land, there's fewer barriers. But it's not all wine and roses. There are racial covenants, if you're familiar with that term, like basically on the deeds to residential properties, it said who could live there and who could not, or mostly who could not live there. And Italians are one of those groups. So even if you were an affluent Italian, you couldn't always buy a home where you wanted to. You might be able to live in, a nice neighborhood, but there were still certain places that you were barred from living. And this, continued into the 1950s. Interestingly enough, there was an Italian-American judge in Los Angeles who was one of the first people to kind of chip away at these racial or restrictive covenants, and his ruling was about Mexican families, but a lot of other groups would also benefit from his decision.
Fascinating. So by the time you wake up one morning and say, I'm going to found a museum and I'm going to make it a big success, what was there one thing that led you to that, or was it a slow burn that got you to that place where you said, we really need to tell this story?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a few factors. So growing up in Los Angeles, as an Italian American, I didn't always understand how I fit into LA, into the Los Angeles mosaic. I didn't always understand how I fit into Italian America as an Italian from LA. So I was, I spent my life as a kid at the library, this is before the information age, obviously. So if you're, and I have to preface that to some of the younger folks in the audience, like if you couldn't find it at the local library or through an interlibrary loan, the information wasn't always available or wasn't available. And so I would literally scan every book I could find on local history and on Italian American history looking for information about Los Angeles. And there was very little, which is why many years later I wrote the book. But I learned about a building on the edge of downtown when I was in college called the Italian Hall. And it was constructed in 1908, and it served as a gathering place for the Italian community for about half a century. And when I learned about this, I was just absolutely floored. And to me, it indicated that there was this history that existed, but that, apparently wasn't documented. So that kind of sparked this, curiosity within me. It drove my research. And the first time, it would drive my research, but the first time I visited the building, it was an undergrad. This is, I think, my second year at UCLA. And the building at that time was this dilapidated mess. And I walked in and I said, this needs to be a museum, and I want to be the director. And I had no idea what I was talking about. There were a couple careers between then and now, but that was what happened. And it was a really long and excruciating process. It still is. But it was, I think, a really worthwhile one.
Well, one of the things when we very first met 5 years ago, I said to you was I had been on your website and I was so impressed with the lesson plans and some of the downloadable educational materials. And, we had a conversation then that, what I've always admired about the Tenement Museum is that they tell a specific yet universal story. And I felt you had really achieved that with the Italian American Museum. And I think your exhibitions, I always envy that I don't get to Los Angeles enough to see all of them, but your exhibitions always have that quality for me. When you talk about lace or textiles, you talk about an Italian tradition, and then immediately create a dialogue about the communities in Los Angeles today that have similar traditions. And you've talked about food in that way and rituals for holidays. And I really admire especially that ability to take something that's very uniquely Italian American and immediately find ways that people can connect to that story. And I know that you do a lot of programming with children. So, we're going to get to the book, but before we get to the book, I'm curious a little bit about, I'm sure there have been a lot of struggles along the way, but you really have achieved something special with the museum. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, who comes to the museum and, what you think people take away from that experience.
Sure. Well, first, and I wanted to begin by saying this, it's been such a pleasure collaborating with Columbus Citizens Foundation, working together since 2021. I think in an odd way, the pandemic brought many of us closer together and encouraged us to establish partnerships that otherwise, sometimes we are all guilty of operating on our little islands. And there's often this like East Coast, West Coast thing. We can get back to that in a second, but so I, just thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure. And I wanted to start with all that. But going back to your question, our reality is that a very small fraction of our visitors are of Italian extraction. So our challenge whenever we design anything, an exhibition, a program, is to make it relatable, engaging, understandable to everyone. And so we oftentimes look at some of these, these themes that are universal, whether it's hard work, whether it's food, family, traditions, and we try to break it down so that, folks have this emotional connection with the content, because it's really, the traditional museum is a bit static and it's this is what we're telling you and read. But we knew that we would lose our audiences if that was our approach. So we try to do things a bit differently. And then also the reality is that as an Italian American organization in Los Angeles, we're not always seen as worthy. And again, because there's not so much awareness that we have this history there, that people often, when it comes to funding, is nah, we're going to give it to the other guys. But again, most of the people we serve are low-income communities. Most of what we do is presented free of charge. So we, in order to kind of be in the running for funding, that's also part of our reality is, we have to speak their language.
Well, I also, want to segue to the book a bit, because you've had an incredibly wealthy set of experiences around your personal history, thinking about Italian American history, indeed this issue of where does Los Angeles fit into the whole story of Italians in the United States, and then these exhibitions, and then weathering the pandemic when you have a physical space. We had the same challenges here. We couldn't have people in the building for a year, so it's challenging when you're place-based to suddenly have that place ripped apart and try to keep your community together. So, with the book, and it's not the first book you've written, but I mean, with this book, what was the, most important theme that you wanted to have people walk away with the book?
Well, it was just incredible to me that a group like Italian Americans could spend 200 years contributing and shaping the region, yet nothing documented it. I mean, there's a handful of people who are maybe somewhat familiar names, certainly some of the Italians of Hollywood, like Frank Capra, who settled in Los Angeles after he immigrated from Sicily, maybe John Fonte, Italian American author, who you hear about in other contexts. But there wasn't anything that really brought together the Italians of Los Angeles in a comprehensive way. So that was really my primary inspiration for writing the book. But it was also a very personal story because, again, being from Los Angeles, I've just since discovered a lot of things through my research, such as, my family was part of what was kind of a common chain migration from Italians elsewhere in the nation who made their way westward and settled in Los Angeles. In my family's case, it was in the 1940s when Los Angeles was kind of an Eden. It was this place of like opportunity, and you could leave a location where maybe the weather was harsher, or there was more prejudice or fewer opportunities, to settle on a palm tree lined street as a working person. My grandfather worked in a mill, in a steel mill. And my father and his brothers bagged groceries to help the family pay off the home. That doesn't happen anymore in Los Angeles, where an entry-level house costs you close to $1 million. But that was the case at the time. And so to be able to contribute to scholarship about Italian American history, and also to be able to contribute to understanding about Los Angeles, which is a city that has contributed so much to the world. It's one of the most photographed cities in the world, but people are largely unaware of its origins. And Los Angeles itself has been a great promoter of myths surrounding itself, and this is something that is touched upon. And
you've got mail.
Speaking of Hollywood,
I didn't realize that still happened.
I haven't either. I've actually never heard that in real life before, so that was excellent.
That was good timing.
Where were we? I think
Myths.
So to be able to expand awareness. If you look at Italian American history, it's often defined as largely an East Coast phenomenon. And yes, the majority of Italians did settle in and around New York. But why did most of our family come here? The majority of Italian immigrants were economic refugees. They came here for opportunity. So if you look at a map of the United States and you plot out where there were, mines, mills, places that need laborers, our families were the ones who kind of answered the call. And so you find Italians in Des Moines, you find Italians in Mississippi and Louisiana, Seattle, Omaha. And I think, we don't realize how large the Italian American tent is. But I like to kind of emphasize the various shades of Italian America. And, Los Angeles is one of those chapters.
So yeah, I think it's interesting what you say. Somebody gave a talk here 2 years ago about Italians in the Pacific Northwest, and it was fascinating to hear how many Italians had worked in mines in the Pacific Northwest. And that's a story we don't tell here in New York very much. And it was incredible how large some of these communities were, and it was because they'd been miners in Italy, so they actually understood exactly the work to be done. I gave a talk last week here about Italian architecture in New York City, and one of the people that I talked about was an architect who actually was a, well-trained, intelligent architect, in Florence, and his father, worked for an insurance company. He was, well off, and he came here to New York initially, but then he went to Cornell and got a second degree in architecture and engineering after being at La Sapienza in Rome. And then instead of being here in New York, which he could have easily done, he actually went to Idaho to head an engineering team for a mining company, did that for a few years, then ended up in Portland, Oregon, and then became dean of the School of Architecture of MIT. And so it's a story we don't tell about, beyond the workforce that came. There were some other people as well. And he was the dean of architecture at MIT for several decades. And when he closed his practice in Oregon, he sold it to Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and became a consultant to them. And so it was a roundabout way of saying to people, here's 2 buildings he designed in New York City, just so you don't think that I've totally made this all up. And he designed Juilliard, and he designed the Pan Am building with Walter Gropius. And so there's still a lot of stories that are untold. And one of the other people I talked about was Eugenio La Rocca, who came to the United States when he was about 6 years old. And he went on to be the designer of theaters in New York City. Sadly, many of them bulldozed in the 1980s when Times Square went through a big redevelopment. But some of the most magnificent Broadway theaters were designed by him, and he's a name we don't know at all. And these were really, really grand buildings. One of them that still exists is the St. George Theater on Staten Island, which was built to hold 2,000 people. I mean, we don't think about the scale. And then he designed an opera house, which very quickly went out of business. It did not have a good run as an opera house, but the building still exists today as Studio 54. And so, we just don't know. So there's still, just like Los Angeles doesn't quite have the platform it should for understanding its role in Italian America, there's still lots of stories even here on the East Coast that we still need to ferret out and make people excited about. So,
well, given our country's appreciation for history these days, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of crossover. You touched upon an interesting point. One of the there's a prominent Italian American artist, Italian born, by the name of Giovanni Smeraldi. And he lived in New York for a while. His work includes Grand Central Station and the Vanderbilt Hotel, which is now, I think, condos on 34th and Park. And he was commissioned to do the Blue Room at the White House, and then he made his way west to Los Angeles and worked on the Biltmore Hotel, which I think some of you stayed at when you were in LA recently. That at that time, the Biltmore was the largest hotel west of Chicago. So you see a lot of crossover, and there's more connections between Los Angeles and New York and the Italian American community than one would imagine. Many Italians started in New York or in Pennsylvania, and for a number of reasons, whether it was economic opportunity or, we also forget that Los Angeles and Southern California was promoted as a destination for health seekers, or if you had some kind of a respiratory challenge, respiratory disease, Los Angeles was a place that you would come and be rehabilitated. Some of my family came to Los Angeles for those reasons. So again, there's more connections between New York and Los Angeles with Italian Americans than we often acknowledge.
Well, before we open it up for questions from the audience, is there anything that we've missed that we should have talked about?
Well, I think, I guess still speaking to that point, the historic connections, many New Yorkers have an idea of what Los Angeles is, but there's often, much more than that, especially when it comes to Italian American history. So perhaps we can tease some more of that out through questions.
Absolutely. Well, go ahead.
One of the things that's been going through my mind is that you live in the center of the media group that dominates the perception of Italian Americans in movies, television, theater. How do any of, without naming names, how do any of the prominent people relate to the Italians in Los Angeles? Many of them were transplanted from New York, obviously. Do you have a commentary on that? What the Italians in media's responsibility maybe should be to helping you say, you focused on New York. This is the Italian experience throughout the country.
Well, considering we're in, as you said, that like the epicenter, the media, or, at least historically, that's changing now. Production's going elsewhere. Sure. We don't have as strong relations as I would hope we did or would with some of the, the Italian Americans we know in the industry. But, that's also changing. really happy to have established some partnerships, and there are some noteworthy Italian Americans in entertainment who have supported the museum in a variety of ways, who are represented at the museum. We have an exhibition dedicated to Italians in the entertainment industry that really examines kind of the role that they played, the contributions that they've made from the very beginnings of the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, but also the role of the entertainment industry in kind of promoting these stereotypes that persist, despite some of the recent emphasis on representation. Representation applies to some, but often not to Italians many times. What I find interesting is when people come to the museum and make those connections, that kind of like, is that really equitable? I would say probably the other area where I really enjoy watching people kind of interact with our content is we have an exhibition on anti-Italianism, and to see young people realize that some of the things that affect their lives today have affected other groups over time, including Italian Americans, and a lot of the discourse is kind of recycled throughout history.
Ms. Gatto, can I just ask a question? I'm just thinking, because you really covered everything, but what is the main role? Because I see Dr. Chels is here, and I go down in the museum, and we know what his role is. But in LA, and I had told you my daughter lives there, and my godson's been very successful there, but what is the role of your museum to Italian Americans, especially the younger generation? What are you trying to instill to them or teach them about Italian culture, artwork, the pride of being Italian American? And I think that's maybe the role you should have. And are you doing that? Is that more or less your motivo, your method of maniere at the museum in LA, as Dr. Chelsea does here in?
I would say it's very similar. I mean, certainly our doors are open to all, and on any given day, if you visit the museum, you'll see that again the majority of our visitors are not of Italian extraction. I feel, however, that's a great opportunity to impart our culture to a much larger group that's often unaware, and their primary educator is, the media. And so, to be given that opportunity to expand their awareness, we present dozens of programs each year, providing opportunities for Italian American youth and non-Italian Americans to interact with our culture, to learn about it, whether it's Italian language or the arts or other aspects of our culture. If we depended only on Italian Americans, even though Los Angeles is home to one of the largest Italian American populations, our numbers wouldn't be as high.
If you get the funding, you get enough of funding to present your programs in LA?
Well, funding, we're a nonprofit organization, and it's, I think, most of those who are in, who know the reality of nonprofits since the pandemic, it's challenging. Again, I think when it comes to an Italian American institution, we're not always seen as like the most worthy, or even, a story that has some kind of a historical basis because of the lack of awareness. But, we don't turn anybody away. Admission to the museum is free. We have about 300,000 people who come through our doors annually. Our permanent exhibition is also accessible online, so we have people from all over the world accessing our content. Lisa touched upon this earlier. The pandemic encouraged us to think out of the box. And while we had a lot of virtual offerings before the pandemic, it really encouraged us to, to kind of continue and think about how not only we produce content, but how we disseminate it and share it. What good is an organization if nobody visits.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in and say, one thing, because it's a complicated dance when you're, a nonprofit institution trying to be as public facing as possible. So I think you pull a lot of different levers. So there's the museum and its exhibitions, but you also have like the festival every fall. I mean, so there are ways that you ratchet up awareness and engagement. Doesn't always translate into dollars, but it's about kind of engaging people in a wider dialogue.
That's absolutely true. Our audiences are so diverse that we try to create something for everyone, and sometimes it's surprising to us. For instance, we did an exhibition a few years back that told Italian American women's stories through needlework, and it seemed like a rather, odd approach perhaps, but it won an award. The exhibition won an award. We were talking about bringing it to New York. Hopefully that happens in the near future. But as part of the exhibition, we presented like a lace making workshop. I thought, we'll probably have 15 people. These people, mostly women, were calling. We filled the first workshop, 50 people, like within the first 3 days. And that wasn't enough. Like, they kept calling, So we ended up presenting 3 additional workshops. And you just never know what people are going to hit on. So again, we have people from like 9 months old to 90 years old. And that in itself can be sometimes a challenge, because you realize, I had a group of high school students visiting the other day who were actually from they're part of an Italian program, an Italian language program at one of the local high schools. And I mentioned Rudolph Valentino, and I said, wait a minute, do you guys know who that is? Like, well, we've heard the name. So I'm like, no. So you realize like how, like, much more than ever, it's this 15-second kind of world that we live in. And I Dua Lipa, I had to, do my own research as to, so that is one of our realities is.
Yeah, but I want to put the 300,000 people in perspective, because that is a more than respectable number of visitors for a relatively small museum. So here in New York City, there's a group called Historic House Trust, and I sit on the board, which is why I know these statistics. So it's 23 houses that sit on city-owned parkland. And the 23 houses all together get about 700,000 visitors. And they run the gamut from Conference House on Staten Island, which is a very beautiful stone house, southernmost point in New York City, looks out on Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and it's called Conference House because that's where John Adams and Benjamin Franklin came to try and negotiate peace with the British. So you could argue that this is one of the most important places for American history, and they get about 7,000 visitors a year. They're never going to get a lot because it is a very, very small place, but it is arguably, hugely important. 500,000 visitors a year go to the Queens County Farm Museum. Why? Because they have little baby animals and a corn maze. And I am not denigrating them at all. It's fantastic to be able to talk about New York City's agricultural history. Queens was the breadbasket of New York City right up to the 1920s. So a very important place, but nonetheless, the Conference House is never going to get the visitation of the Queens County Farm Museum. And so, if you're getting 300,000 people in Los Angeles, like that, in the small museum world, that is a hugely important number.
And just, full disclosure, I know that we would not get those numbers if it wasn't for our location. So we're located at a major tourist destination that's home to other museums. Admission is free. People don't necessarily come seeking us, but they might be at the Chinese American Museum, which is across the way, or the oldest house in Los Angeles, which is also just right, footsteps away. And our doors are open. They wander in and they go, oh wow, I never knew this was here. In a place like Los Angeles, we're competing with the Getty, the Skirball, all these major institutions that have promotion budgets that are close to probably our entire operating budget. Another story entirely. So I don't think we would necessarily get these numbers if it wasn't for our location. And then I think also the fact that in places like New York and Los Angeles, it's, I think, harder and harder these days for people who aren't of significant means to like take their family out on a weekend. And so we're also kind of proud to be an affordable educational experience. And that's what we hope to continue being.
That's great. Another question?
Yeah. Did you find, like, in your research in your book, that during the war, particularly from 1940 to 42, that the Enemy Alien Status Act caused more disruption in the Italian families on the West Coast than they did on the East Coast, because on the East Coast, FDR kept it quiet, and he allowed DeWitt to openly take the Italians and put them into internment camps. Did you find that?
Yes. So thank you for that question. The Italians of the West Coast were more affected by the wartime restrictions than the Italians of the East Coast. Why? If you were going to, place restrictions on travel and residency and in turn, what was then millions of people in New York, millions of Italians, you would have eliminated a huge Democratic voting bloc. Yep. You would have disrupted the war effort, which, wasn't, there were a lot of Italians on the West Coast contributing significantly to the war effort. Or their parents were, subject to a lot of restrictions, including relocation and internment, while their sons were serving in the United States military. I mean, Italian Americans were the largest ethnic group and the most decorated serving in the U.S. military during World War II. I think the wartime experience drove a lot of Italian Americans underground on the West Coast. We became closeted Italians. It was like our Italianità was something that many of us came to express privately, but publicly we emphasized our Americanness. You saw families change their names, especially in Los Angeles. The Di Giorgio family became Di George. There is a very famous Italian restaurant in Los Angeles that was originally the Italian American grocery and restaurant. They became Little Joe's. Eliminate any reference to Italian Americans. And again, why? There were a lot of Italians living on the West Coast. It was this very strategic military area. But if you were to relocate all the Italians on the East Coast, you would have had riots. And I think LaGuardia was very instrumental in pushing back against Roosevelt and saying, like, listen, we're going to march on Washington if you try this with us here. And so, hats off to LaGuardia for that. But you see things like the number of households that spoke Italian before the war versus after. And look what it did to our language and our culture. Like it was a tremendous interruption to the transmission of Italian culture. And even in my own family, we had two, I call them uncles, even though they were my father's cousins, who were fighting in World War II. But the family was afraid during those years. And, they were the Cortese family. They became Cortese. And I always wondered, like, why are they Scottish and we're Italian? They're my cousins, but they were, one of them is in her 90s. There are actually two sisters that are still alive and they're in their 90s. I'm like, how are you guys blonde and the rest of us are so dark? Because they really, I just didn't understand the relationship. But that was, it's a phenomenon that you feel, you sense on the West Coast more so than here.
Let's have a question on this side of the room.
It's relevant, piggybacks off his question. In my research recently, and on the same topic, I've just been curious. I've seen a phenomenon. So I gave walking tours in Little Italy for the Italian American Museum here, and we do talk about the Enemy Alien Sedition Act. And I noticed a pattern, and I noticed it even with my own parents who are in their 70s. Most Italian Americans that I encounter are clueless when I tell them about this history. Can you comment on that phenomenon in your own personal experience and research? Because I'm grappling with it myself, and I would be happy to hear your thoughts on it.
You know, this, the wartime experience has been, Lawrence de Sassi, I believe, was the one who called it una storia segreta, the secret history, because Italians, maybe if this had happened today, it would be different, but at the Italians of that time, they internalized it. It was like, what did we do? And be quiet about it. Don't call attention. Interesting story, when we were working on the museum, creating our exhibitions, I had a board member take me aside and say, don't talk about that. We don't want to talk about that. And well, we have an exhibition dedicated to it and a curriculum. And he's still a board member. He doesn't, I don't know if he's forgiven me for it, but it was this secrecy. We've had a few families who have come to us and donate the belongings of their family members who were affected by the restrictions. And it was just, fascinating, some of the stories that they shared. One woman took it to her grave. And, they kept some of the registration certificates or the enemy alien ID cards. This one woman who, her ID card is on display at the museum. She had three sons serving in the US military, but felt compelled to never discuss what happened. And it's just, I think that's a very uniquely Italian reaction. We were hesitant to ever think of ourselves and, wave the victim flag. And unfortunately, when it comes to, preserving some of our history, it's been detrimental. But I love to see us talk about it and really hopefully flesh out some more of these stories, because again, so many of them were taken to the grave and they're gone.
And to put it into nationwide curriculum, because it's missing.
Yes. Way back when, I worked with our senator in California, Anthony Portantino, to have it included in the California curriculum. And so now it is mentioned. So it meant, the way it reads is the restrictions on Japanese, Germans, and Italians during World War II. But the teachers aren't aware of it. We have to teach the teachers.
Right.
They're all clueless, like teachers, parents, adults. And I've just been kind of thinking through the patterns that I see. And this is kind of the conclusion that I had, is like kind of the internalized shame, which is cultural,
yes.
But it just still baffles me.
And ironically, a lot of the, some of the funding to support these types of things has not come from the Italian American community, it's come from other groups.
Joe?
If you might, I give you a lot of credit for your success.
And I give you a lot of credit for your success. You were our benchmark. You understand how much I looked up to you for, I said, I'm going to move to New York and work at the Tenement Museum or the IAM. That was my...
Work at the Tenement. You did a great job. I've been at your museum. You're doing fantastic work. And, maybe I was a little bit before you, but you're certainly, and Marie also, are the professionals of the future. I didn't have the same success with you that you did in New York. I had the bill introduced in the New York State Senate, and the Assembly refused to pass it. So we could not get it included in the curriculum in New York State. There's still a lot of prejudice, and there's still a lot of people that really just do not want to look at us and understand that we went through hard times too. But thank God that you're there, and I believe that we are the future. When I say we, the museum's the future for the Italian American community, because we tell the story that nobody else tells, and that we be there, because they're not being told in the schools.
No.
We know that. At least we're telling them in the museums and in the foundation as well, of course, for doing this type of work. But we're getting out to the masses. And I see at the Italian American Museum in New York, just like you do, many non-Italians, and they relate to what we have. I want my hats off to you, though. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's interesting because I think with that shame and the secrecy, whether it's about the World War II experience or just the experience of being associated with a group that often, I mean, I still get this, my last name is Gatto, Gatto. And every once in a while, I'll have somebody say, any relation? I'm like, to what? Are you connected? I'm like, to what? And, they'll Gatto and Gotti. Two different names, but like just still anything Italian, this is where we go into like the double standard in terms of like what you can say and what you can't say. Italians are still kind of fair game, but we often find that there's more non-Italian Americans who are interested in learning our history than Italian Americans, because there was this like, no, we don't talk about that, or there's this shame, or like the only things that we could discuss are like the mandolins and the pizza, and church, and I'm a devout Catholic, but there's a lot more to our history than that, but there's still this kind of hesitation on the part of Italian Americans to interact with their heritage in a way other than, pizza, mafia, or mandolins.
Well, let's take one more question. I see a hand there.
Thank you. Being a sports junkie, I've always been aware of all of the Italian superstars that have been in America, and I think there are actually some interesting connections between California and New York. Joe DiMaggio was a minor league baseball player for the San Francisco Seals when the Yankees picked him. And I was just wondering if the museum is, I think just the average American is more aware of the Italian heritage, because there are so many incredible, really, Italian American sports figures. I haven't been to the museum, it's on my list, but if you had anything to say about that.
So we have one of our permanent exhibitions is called Culture, and it looks at everything that's part of culture. So faith, cuisine, the arts, sports, and I can keep on going, but let's focus on sports for a moment. So if you grew up in Los Angeles like I did, my childhood was Tommy Lasorda and Vin Scully, and the Dodgers on the radio. So we have some of his memorabilia. We look at the role that sports played in the acculturation of especially working class immigrant youth. And we also look at some Italian American women in sports. So there is one of my favorite people that I researched as part of the book was a woman named Nina Vitaliano, who was a race car driver during the World War I era.
Yes.
And I won't spoil the story for you to read about it, but she is one of the women, one of the reasons why automobile racing remains a largely male-dominated sport. But yeah, so there's a lot of sports history in LA. LA was a big boxing city, Olympic Auditorium, so many greats came there. Fidel La Barba, why am I blanking on it? And Lou Zamperini, if you ever saw the film Unbroken, he was, Italian American from Torrance, the South Bay. So he's also in the museum, but yeah, lots of great sports.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for your time.
You've given us a great, I don't want to call it introduction, you've given us a great sense of all the history there is to learn. And you'll have to come back for, the next installment. So,
Thank you so much.
This is great. Thank you for being with us.